But no, it's an enormous pleasure to be here. You know, I was going to talk about, since I thought this was a German-American event, I thought I would talk about some of the issues relating to Europe, the United States, globalization, the Euro crises. And then, as journalists often have to do, I looked out of the window and realized what was going on around the world, and I thought probably better if I talk a little bit about the Middle East. I think that what is striking about what is happening now in the Middle East is that it is now clear that this is really something systemic. This is something beyond one country. Right? For a while you could look back and look at the isolated event, but what you have seen now is something that began in Tunisia, went to Egypt, went to Bahrain, now in Libya, and of course there have been smaller events in places like Jordan and even in Saudi Arabia. There is talk, for example, of forming political parties in Saudi Arabia, something that is officially illegal. So I've been thinking to myself, well, what is it actually that's happening here? And if you think about it, this is something unique in Arab history. It is perhaps the first time in a millennium that the Arabs are taking control of their own destiny, of their own fate. What we think of as Arab civilization sprung up in about the 7th century AD, came onto the world with a new religion and began spreading it through conquest and persuasion. And that religion of Islam and Arab civilization were intermingled for several centuries thereafter. But about the 10th, 11th century, what begins to happen is the Arabs start suffering military defeats. First at the hands of the Turks, the Persians, the Mongols. And from about the 11th century, the Arabs are under the political control of foreigners. The Persians, the Mongols, the Turks battle it out. The Turks eventually win, and the Arabs are effectively ruled by the Ottomans for centuries, though always with the Persians contesting some parts of what is now the Arab world. Then, by the late 18th century, Napoleon's small expedition goes to Egypt and conquers Egypt. And what is extraordinary about that event is this small expeditionary force from France conquers this great Arab state. But then the expedition goes away in a few years, not because of anything the Egyptians do, but because the British, the Royal Navy, chases them out. And so two European powers settle their disputes by deciding who will actually run this Arab country. And from then on you see rising European influence. And for about a century and a half, the Middle East becomes a playground for the European great powers. The most vivid demonstration of that, of course, is 1919, the end of the Cold War, when the French and the British carve up what was the remnants of the Ottoman Empire and create most of the modern Middle East. Most of what we now think of as the Middle East were states created by the British and French at that period. 1945, the end of the World War II, European empires collapse, and you have the dawn of a new age of outside domination. That is, of course, the Soviet Union and the United States. Each superpower picks or is petitioned a set of allies to whom it provides protection, arms, and aid. And that era continues for about a half century until 1990, when the Soviet Union collapses. And at that point, the United States is the only superpower in the region, the only external power that has the ability to effect some kind of political influence or control in the region. The only contester, in a sense, is a regional power, the strongest regional power by some measures, Iran, which tries to present itself as the alternative to American hegemony in the region, but with very limited success. Outside of Lebanon and a few pockets of influence with non-state actors, with some groups, it's difficult to see the reach of Iranian influence. Now, during this whole period of, as I say, about 1,000 years, it is not as though the Arabs didn't have their own rulers. They were always ruled by locals. But these local rulers were always supported, assisted, sometimes picked by the outsiders, by the foreigners. And these rulers were very skilled at negotiating up to the outside authority that was supporting them, that was in some way sustaining them. they were less well equipped at negotiating down, that is, dealing with their actual people. That they tended to do in a variety of different ways, mostly through brute force and suppression. With the rise of oil wealth, there came other ways as well. But what is extraordinary about this moment we're in is that something has changed in the Arab world, and there is a sense that they are now masters of their own fate. Now, what has changed? Well, I think over the last decade, there were two big shifts that took place, American shifts, that have opened up space in the Arab world. And they can be kind of described by the two presidents who have run America since then. The first was a shift that recognized that there was an enormous cost, a national security cost to America's policy of supporting all these dictatorships in the Middle East. And that was that it bred an oppositional movement that was extreme, religious, and anti-American. In other words, the reason Al-Qaeda was attacking Americans was not unrelated to America's support for the regimes of Hosni Mubarak and the Saudi Arabian royal family. Al-Qaeda is essentially a Saudi-Egyptian creation. You know, if you put it bluntly, it is Saudi Arabian money and Egyptian brains. The Saudi Osama bin Laden financed it. The Egyptian Ayman Zawahiri, the number 2 man, was the brains behind it, was the man who wrote most of the political tracts, was the ideologist. And even in the September 11 attacks, you see that Saudi-Egyptian partnership, and you see the nature of that Saudi-Egyptian partnership. There were 19 people involved, 4 Egyptians, 15 Saudis. The 4 Egyptians were the brains behind the operation. They were the 4 pilots. The 15 Saudis were the brawn. They were the ones who hustled the passengers at the back. And that partnership, that relationship between American support for these regimes and the blowback of these terrorism is something that the Bush administration frontally recognized and then articulated. George Bush has had many problems as a president. I did not support much of what he did, but I think it is fair to say that in taking on the issue of America's support for dictatorships in the Middle East and breaking with that policy rhetorically, and breaking with it in a very public and significant way, he marked a very important shift in America's attitude to the Middle East. The second one is something kind of slightly different, and in some ways, also a product of the Bush administration, which was the decline of American power in the Middle East. The United States was reigning supreme in the Middle East in 2000, 2001, and then you saw a series of events that began to take place, which erode dramatically American power. First and most important one, of course, is the Iraq War, which not only is seen as an naked act of American imperialism that delegitimized American power, but then was seen as a highly unsuccessful endeavor, which therefore delegitimized American competence. And there are people who say that the latter is more significant than the former in the Middle East. People thought that the United States was the gang that couldn't shoot straight, didn't know what it was doing in Iraq. But in any event, by 2006, 2007, the sense of America as this powerful, all-controlling, all-knowing force in the Middle East had declined considerably. Then you saw Afghanistan, the continuing turmoil in Afghanistan. Then you see the Middle East peace process, which seems as far away from any kind of resolution today as it has at any point in the last 40 years. And all of this produces a sense that the United States has really a very different standing in the Middle East than it once did. Now, I don't know that this is any one president's fault, but it's certainly true that it is represented and symbolized by Barack Obama, who has taken a less imperial attitude to the world in general, and one that is marked by his acknowledgement of the limits of American power. So that if you look at his famous Cairo speech at Al-Azhar, in which he speaks about the need for democracy in the Middle East, it is markedly different from Bush because he continues after saying that, to point out that the United States has no desire, no intention, no ability to impose any form of government on any of the Arab peoples. So it is very much an attempt to pull America out of that equation and allow for a kind of indigenous Arab movement. So if you were to look at it in purely geopolitical terms and pure power terms, you would have to come to the conclusion that that long series of foreign domination I described is now concluded by a United States that has neither the power nor the inclination to wish to dominate the affairs of the Middle East. At least not in the way it once did, and certainly not in the way that other external powers have wanted to do. You see the change in attitudes in the United States, by the way, in the WikiLeaks documents. The WikiLeaks documents from the Middle East are full of American ambassadors talking about how they feel that the dictatorship that they are serving under is stagnant, is lethargic, is not reforming, needs to do more, is not responding to the aspirations of its people, and how it's a terrible dilemma for the United States to be stuck supporting this regime. Now, I have a feeling that some Egyptians might have read those documents too, and some Tunisians might have read those documents too. In other words, the signal that the United States was not 100% behind these dictatorships, the signal that the United States was not going to intervene in support of these dictatorships, was probably quite strong. We may look back and say, well, did anyone really think the United States was going to go to war to support Hosni Mubarak's dictatorship? You forget. First of all, in the Middle East, people all believe these regimes exist because of American support. And secondly, there was a long period of time where the United States did support unquestioningly all these governments. And so I have a feeling that what has happened over the last few years is that these forces that I described, these two shifts, the decline in both the capacity and the inclination of the United States to do something to support these regimes, has been in various intangible ways more noticeable. And it has opened up space in the Middle East. It has opened up space for what is really a Middle Eastern phenomenon. I mean, this is to me the most interesting thing about what we've been witnessing. We've been told for many, many years about the Arab street, right? And we were told that the Arab street was basically anti-American, anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian. And when the Arab street finally erupted, what we discovered was it's actually worse than that. They don't care about us. What they're mostly concerned about is the conditions they live under, the regimes they live under, the undemocratic nature of the regimes, the incompetent nature of the regimes, and that has been the fundamental force behind this great movement.